Picture this. You're sitting alone in a completely quiet room with nothing but your own thoughts for company. No phone, no music, no distractions, just you and your mind. How long before you feel the overwhelming urge to escape? If you're like most people, the answer is not very long at all. Here's something that will disturb you. Researchers at the University of Virginia discovered that when given the choice between sitting alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes or giving themselves painful electric shocks, 67% of men and 25% of women chose to shock themselves rather than face their own mental landscape. Think about that for a moment. People literally preferred physical pain to psychological solitude. But why? What is it about our own minds that feels so threatening that we'll choose suffering over self-reflection? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of human psychology, spent decades studying this exact phenomenon. What he discovered will fundamentally change how you understand your relationship with your own consciousness. Jung realized that most people don't just dislike being alone with their thoughts. They're actively terrified of what they might discover if they look too deeply within themselves. This fear is so profound that it shapes virtually every aspect of how we live, from our desperate need for constant stimulation to our resistance to genuine personal growth. Right now, millions of people are living in a state of psychological exile from themselves, constructing elaborate defense mechanisms to avoid confronting their own mental reality. They fill every moment with noise, activity, and external focus because the alternative, genuine self-encounter, feels unbearably threatening. Before we embark on this potentially uncomfortable but transformative exploration, engage with this content. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of psychological explorers. Give this video a like if you're already recognizing something unsettling about your own relationship with solitude, and drop a comment about the last time you sat in complete silence with your thoughts. Share this with someone who might be ready to stop running from themselves. In the next few minutes, we're going to uncover the hidden psychological mechanisms that make self-reflection feel so threatening, explore why your mind seems designed to avoid itself, and discover how to develop what Jung called the courage for self-encounter. The revelation waiting at the end will show you how to transform your greatest fear into your greatest source of strength and wisdom. Are you ready to discover why you've been afraid of your own mind? Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth that most people never consciously acknowledge. The average person spends virtually no time in genuine solitude with their own thoughts. And this isn't accidental. It's a carefully constructed psychological defense system designed to avoid something that feels fundamentally threatening. Dr. Manoush Zomorodi's research on boredom and brilliance reveals that the average person checks their phone 150 times per day, once every 6.5 minutes during waking hours. But here's what's truly revealing. People report feeling anxious and uncomfortable during the brief moments between checking their devices. Those few seconds of potential self-reflection trigger immediate escape behaviors. Jung understood this pattern decades before smartphones existed. He wrote extensively about what he called the flight from self-knowledge, the unconscious but systematic avoidance of genuine introspection. He observed that people will engage in almost any activity, no matter how meaningless or destructive, to avoid confronting their own psychological reality. Think about your own patterns honestly. When was the last time you sat in complete silence without any external stimulation? When did you last allow yourself to experience boredom without immediately reaching for a distraction? How often do you find yourself filling every quiet moment with music, podcasts, scrolling, or some form of mental escape? This avoidance isn't just about preference, it's about psychological survival. Dr. Timothy Wilson's research at the University of Virginia demonstrates that most people find sustained self-reflection genuinely distressing. When forced to sit alone with their thoughts for even brief periods, participants show measurable increases in stress hormones, anxiety, and what psychologists call negative affect. But here's what's truly disturbing. Jung discovered that this fear of our own minds isn't protecting us from something external. It's protecting us from ourselves, specifically from aspects of our personality, memories, desires, and truths that we've unconsciously decided are too threatening to acknowledge. The question becomes, What exactly are we so afraid of discovering? What could be lurking in our own consciousness that feels more threatening than electric shocks, more unbearable than physical discomfort? To understand this fear, we need to explore Jung's most revolutionary insight, the concept of the unconscious mind and why it feels so dangerous to conscious awareness. Carl Jung's greatest psychological insight emerged from a disturbing personal experience. During what he called his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1919, Jung experienced a psychological crisis that brought him face to face with aspects of his own mind that terrified him. Instead of running from this experience, he did something unprecedented. He studied it. What Jung discovered during this period revolutionized psychology. The human mind contains vast territories of psychological content that remain hidden from conscious awareness. He called this realm the unconscious, and he realized that most people spend their lives in terror of accidentally encountering its contents. Jung's concept of the shadow explains exactly why self-reflection feels so threatening. The shadow contains everything about yourself that you've unconsciously rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. Your capacity for selfishness, violence, jealousy, inadequacy, and moral failure. It's not that these qualities don't exist, it's that they've been banished from conscious awareness. Dr. Jennifer Aker's research on self-concept maintenance demonstrates that people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their idealized self-image. When confronted with evidence that contradicts their preferred self-narrative, individuals show immediate stress responses and deploy sophisticated psychological defenses to avoid processing the threatening information. Here's what makes this particularly disturbing. Jung realized that the shadow doesn't disappear because you ignore it. Instead, it influences your behavior unconsciously, creating what he called shadow projection, seeing in others the very qualities you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The people who annoy you most intensely are often reflecting your own disowned shadow material. Think about this carefully. What qualities do you judge most harshly in others? What behaviors trigger your strongest emotional reactions? What aspects of human nature do you find most disturbing or unacceptable? Jung would suggest that these intense reactions point directly toward your own shadow content, the parts of yourself you're most afraid to encounter. But the shadow is only one layer of what makes self-reflection feel so threatening. There's something even deeper that most people unconsciously avoid, and it has to do with the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Stay with me, because what we're about to explore will challenge everything you think you know about your own mind and why it feels so dangerous to examine closely. Here's a revelation that will disturb you. One of the primary reasons people fear their own minds is the unconscious recognition that they're not actually in control of their thoughts, emotions, or many of their behaviors. This loss of perceived control triggers what psychologists call existential anxiety, a profound fear of psychological chaos. Dr. Daniel Kahneman's groundbreaking research on cognitive biases reveals that the vast majority of mental processing occurs outside conscious awareness. What you experience as your thoughts are actually the final products of unconscious mental processes that you neither control nor understand. Your mind is constantly generating content that surprises, disturbs, or conflicts with your conscious intentions. Jung understood this psychological reality intimately. He wrote about the experience of being thought by thoughts rather than thinking them. The recognition that consciousness often feels more like a passive observer of mental content than an active controller of it. This realization can be profoundly unsettling for people who believe they're the conscious authors of their mental experience. Consider your own experience honestly. How often do thoughts arise that you didn't intend to think? How frequently do emotions emerge that seem to come from nowhere? When was the last time you tried to stop thinking about something and discovered that you couldn't? How often does your mind wander to places you'd prefer it not go? This lack of mental control becomes particularly threatening when combined with what Jung called the autonomous nature of psychological complexes. He discovered that the human psyche contains semi-independent psychological structures that can take over consciousness temporarily, creating experiences of being beside yourself or not yourself. Dr. Ethan Kross's research on self-talk demonstrates that people often experience their own thoughts as coming from multiple, sometimes conflicting internal voices. This multiplicity of mental experience challenges the comforting illusion of having a unified, coherent self that's in charge of mental processes. But here's what's truly frightening to most people. If you're not in control of your own mind, then who or what is? This question touches on fundamental issues of identity, agency, and psychological security that most people unconsciously avoid by staying distracted and externally focused. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of mental self-avoidance, the recognition that sustained self-reflection might reveal truths about yourself and your life that you're not prepared to accept. The deepest reason people fear their own minds isn't just about losing control. It's about the terrifying possibility that honest self-reflection might reveal truths they're not ready to face. Jung called this the moral cowardice of the average person when confronted with authentic self-knowledge. Dr. Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance explains why self-reflection can feel so threatening. When our actions, beliefs, or self-perceptions conflict with evidence from honest self-examination, we experience psychological discomfort so intense that most people will do anything to avoid it, including avoiding self-reflection entirely. Think about the uncomfortable questions you avoid asking yourself. Are you living according to your authentic values or just following social expectations? Are your relationships based on genuine connection or mutual convenience? Is your career fulfilling your deeper purpose or just paying the bills? Do you actually like the person you've become, or are you afraid to evaluate honestly? Jung observed that people often construct elaborate self-deceptions to avoid confronting these difficult truths. What he called the persona, the mask we wear to gain social acceptance, can become so convincing that we forget it's not our authentic self. The fear of discovering the gap between persona and authentic self keeps people trapped in external focus and constant distraction. Dr. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion reveals that people often avoid self-reflection because they unconsciously expect it to lead to harsh self-criticism, overwhelming guilt, or devastating self-judgment. The anticipation of psychological pain makes avoidance feel like emotional self-protection. But here's the paradox Jung identified. The very things we're most afraid to discover about ourselves through honest self-reflection are often the keys to psychological liberation and authentic growth. The truths we avoid are frequently the ones that, once faced consciously, lose their power to control us unconsciously. This avoidance creates what Jung called psychological inflation, living in an idealized but ultimately false version of yourself that requires constant maintenance and defense. The energy required to maintain these self-deceptions is enormous and leaves people feeling exhausted, anxious, and somehow inauthentic without understanding why. But there's an even deeper layer to this fear of mental self-encounter that touches on existential questions about the nature of consciousness and human existence itself. The most profound reason people fear their own minds touches on what existential psychologists call the terror of existence itself, the unconscious recognition that consciousness comes with responsibilities, choices, and ultimate aloneness that feel overwhelmingly burdensome. Jung's exploration of what he called the collective unconscious revealed that individual consciousness emerges from and remains connected to vast, impersonal psychological forces that operate beyond personal control. This recognition can trigger what he described as cosmic anxiety, the fear of being insignificant in an incomprehensible universe. Dr. Irvin Yalom's research on existential anxiety identifies 4 primary sources of psychological terror that people encounter during deep self-reflection: the inevitability of death, the burden of freedom and responsibility, the fundamental isolation of individual consciousness, and the absence of inherent meaning in existence. When people sit quietly with their own thoughts, these existential realities often surface unconsciously, creating anxiety that feels unbearable. The recognition that you're ultimately alone with your consciousness, responsible for creating your own meaning, and facing an uncertain future, can trigger panic responses that make distraction feel like psychological survival. Jung understood that modern culture provides endless opportunities to avoid these existential confrontations through what he called participation mystique, losing individual consciousness in group activities, ideologies, or mass entertainment that provide temporary escape from the isolation and responsibility of individual existence. Consider how uncomfortable these thoughts make you right now. You are ultimately alone with your own consciousness. Every choice you make carries consequences you'll have to live with. There's no external authority that can tell you definitively how to live your life. Your existence will end and you don't know when or how. Does contemplating these realities trigger anxiety or an urge to think about something else? This existential anxiety explains why people often report feeling most depressed and anxious during quiet, solitary moments when external distractions aren't available to buffer these fundamental truths about human existence. But Jung discovered something remarkable. The same self-reflection that initially feels so threatening can become a source of profound strength, wisdom, and authentic freedom if you develop the psychological tools to engage with it consciously rather than avoid it unconsciously. Before we explore Jung's solution to this psychological dilemma, we need to understand the devastating cost of spending your life running from your own mind. The consequences of mental self-avoidance extend far beyond simple discomfort. They fundamentally shape how you experience reality itself. Dr. Matthew Lieberman's research on the default mode network reveals that people who consistently avoid self-reflection show decreased activity in brain regions associated with self-awareness, empathy, and psychological integration. Chronic mental avoidance literally changes your brain's capacity for self-understanding and authentic relationship with others. Jung identified several specific consequences of what he called the flight from inner reality. First, increased susceptibility to psychological projection, seeing your own rejected qualities in others and responding with inappropriate emotional intensity. Second, the development of what he called neurotic symptoms, anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems that stem from unconscious psychological conflicts. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the gradual loss of authentic self-direction. When you avoid honest self-reflection, you lose contact with your genuine values, desires, and purposes, leaving you vulnerable to external manipulation and social programming. You become what Jung called a collective person, someone who lives according to mass opinion rather than authentic individual development. Dr. Sherry Turkle's research on Alone Together demonstrates that people who can't tolerate solitude with their own thoughts show decreased capacity for genuine intimacy and authentic relationships with others. The inability to be present with your own mind creates an inability to be truly present with other people. Perhaps most tragically, chronic self-avoidance creates what Jung called the unlived life, existence characterized by constant busyness but little authentic engagement, perpetual seeking but never finding, and a persistent sense that something essential is missing without knowing what it is. Think about the cost in your own life. How much energy do you spend on distractions that provide no lasting satisfaction? How often do you feel like you're going through the motions without genuine engagement? When was the last time you felt truly connected to your authentic self and purposes? But here's the hopeful truth Jung discovered. Once you understand why self-reflection feels so threatening, you can develop the psychological courage and tools necessary to transform your relationship with your own mind from fear to friendship. Jung's solution to the problem of mental self-avoidance wasn't to minimize the difficulty of self-reflection or pretend it isn't genuinely challenging. Instead, he developed what he called the attitude of conscious courage, a systematic approach to facing your own mind without being destroyed by what you discover. The first element of Jung's approach is what he called active imagination, a method of conscious engagement with unconscious content that allows you to explore your mental landscape without being overwhelmed by it. Rather than passive reception of whatever thoughts and emotions arise, active imagination involves deliberate dialogue with different aspects of your psyche. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes's work on befriending the psyche demonstrates that people who learn to approach their own minds with curiosity rather than judgment develop remarkable psychological resilience and self-understanding. The key is shifting from viewing your thoughts and emotions as threats to seeing them as information about your psychological state. Jung's second crucial insight was the importance of what he called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to resolve psychological conflicts quickly through denial or projection, conscious individuals learn to tolerate the discomfort of internal contradiction until genuine integration becomes possible. The third element is developing what Jung called a personal relationship with the unconscious, treating your own psyche as a legitimate source of wisdom rather than just random mental noise to be ignored or suppressed. This involves paying attention to dreams, recognizing emotional patterns, and taking your psychological responses seriously as meaningful communication. Dr. James Hollis's research on individuation shows that people who develop conscious relationships with their own minds experience significant improvements in emotional regulation, life satisfaction, and what psychologists call psychological differentiation, the ability to maintain authentic selfhood even under social pressure. Most importantly, Jung discovered that the fears that keep people running from self-reflection are almost always worse than the actual experience of honest self-encounter. The anticipated psychological devastation rarely occurs, while the benefits of self-knowledge compound over time. This leads us to the practical question: how do you actually begin developing the courage to face your own mind without being overwhelmed by what you discover? Developing a healthy relationship with your own consciousness requires what Jung called graduated exposure, slowly building tolerance for self-reflection through consistent but manageable practice. Here's how to begin this transformation without triggering the avoidance mechanisms that have kept you externally focused. Start with what Jung called the practice of conscious breathing, spending just 5 minutes daily in quiet breathing without any external stimulation. Don't try to control your thoughts or achieve any particular state. Simply notice what arises in your awareness without judgment or immediate action. The second practice involves what Jung termed shadow acknowledgement, deliberately recognizing moments when you judge others harshly and asking, what aspect of myself am I seeing reflected here? This transforms projection back into self-awareness without requiring you to approve of the shadow qualities you discover. Third, develop what Jung called dream literacy, paying attention to your dreams not as random brain activity, but as meaningful communication from unconscious aspects of your psyche. Keep a dream journal and notice recurring themes, emotions, or symbols without trying to interpret them immediately. Fourth, practice what Jung described as emotional archaeology. When strong emotions arise, instead of immediately distracting yourself or acting on them, pause and ask, what is this emotion trying to tell me about my psychological state? What need or value might it be protecting or expressing? Most importantly, approach this process with what Jung called compassionate curiosity rather than harsh self-judgment. The goal isn't to discover that you're perfect, but to develop an honest, accepting relationship with your complete psychological reality, including aspects you'd prefer to change. Dr. Kristin Neff's research demonstrates that people who approach self-reflection with self-compassion rather than self-criticism make faster progress and experience less emotional overwhelm during the process of authentic self-discovery. These practices gradually build what Jung called ego strength, the psychological capacity to remain conscious and stable while encountering previously unconscious aspects of your personality and experience. Let's return to where we began. That image of yourself sitting alone in a quiet room with nothing but your own thoughts for company. After everything we've explored, does that scenario still feel as threatening as it did 30 minutes ago? Jung's revolutionary insight was that the mind you've been running from isn't your enemy. It's your greatest untapped resource for wisdom, creativity, and authentic self-direction. The very psychological content you've been avoiding through constant distraction contains the keys to psychological freedom and genuine fulfillment. The fear of your own mind is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. You've been treating your psyche as a dangerous wilderness to be avoided, rather than a rich inner landscape to be explored with appropriate preparation and support. When approached consciously, even the most challenging aspects of your mental experience become sources of strength rather than threats to stability. Think about what changes when you stop running from your own consciousness. You develop genuine self-knowledge rather than living according to other people's expectations. You access your authentic values and purposes rather than following social programming. You become psychologically self-reliant rather than dependent on external validation and distraction. Most importantly, you discover what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold complexity, uncertainty, and internal contradiction without losing psychological balance. This is the foundation of genuine wisdom and emotional maturity. The research is clear. People who develop healthy relationships with their own minds show increased creativity, improved decision-making, greater emotional resilience, and what psychologists call authentic happiness, fulfillment based on genuine self-expression rather than external achievement. But this transformation requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to face psychological truths that might challenge your preferred self-image or require you to change patterns that no longer serve your authentic development. Here's your challenge. Starting today, spend 10 minutes in complete silence with your own thoughts. Don't try to meditate or achieve any particular state. Simply sit quietly and notice what happens in your awareness without immediately distracting yourself or judging what you discover. Pay attention to what this experience reveals. What thoughts arise that you usually avoid? What emotions emerge when you're not immediately suppressing or escaping them? What patterns do you notice in your mental activity when you actually observe it consciously? Tell us in the comments what you discovered during your first experiment with conscious self-reflection. Like this video if it's helped you understand why you've been avoiding your own mind, and subscribe for more explorations into the psychology of consciousness and authentic self-development. Most importantly, share this with someone who might be ready to stop running from themselves and start the profound work of conscious self-encounter. The world desperately needs people who have developed genuine self-knowledge and authentic self-direction. Remember, your mind isn't your enemy. It's your greatest ally in creating a life of genuine meaning, purpose, and psychological freedom. The courage to face your own consciousness is the first step toward the authentic existence that Jung called individuation. Until next time, stop running from your mind and start befriending it. The wisdom you've been seeking outside yourself has been waiting patiently within your own consciousness all along.